£10,000 fine.
£10,000 fine. Two women meeting to go for a walk, and they actually were fined
£10,000.
And then it was actually taken back because actually they
yeah, but look at the stress they had to go through.
But if you are, my point is, if you are, as a government, whether you can govern properly or not, we know it's not possible really, but you don't understand the basic difference between right and wrong. Your general public, your population, your people of your country who are paying the taxes, going to work, getting stressed, have the responsibility, trying to pay the mortgage, and you are now trying to put them on trial. You are trying to squeeze their liberties and their independence out of them for 13 or 14 months.
Which brings us back.
Can you justify that?
Well, you can justify it with the social reset narrative. And as I said to you, my two suggestions for why this nonsense is going on is, one, there is no organisation, and this is entire media hysteria and global narrative. And I was increasingly wondering whether this was the case. I mean, all you have to do is look at the idiocy in all the governments. But there has been more and more proof that people knew about this way before. For instance, January, February last year, 31 CEOs resigned their positions for no reason that we know of. 31 of large corporations. Also, I know, for instance, that the Greek government were passing through legislation in November 2019 about restricting travel. Isn't that interesting? And if you now look at green initiatives, green initiatives are all nonsense. What I mean, and of course, green is good. The idea, let me hasten to add, but the current mechanism is more harmful to the environment than petroleum. And in fact, a lot of petroleum companies are heavily investing in these new toxic green initiatives. Solar panels, for instance. There was an article this morning complaining about the fact that thousands of acres are being put over to solar panels that are inefficient and ultimately toxic for the environment and need to be replaced and again are more toxic for the environment. No green initiative is better for the environment than petroleum or nuclear power.
Can I go back to steer us back?
But if that's the case, and we know that fishing is going to run out of economically harvestable fishing by 2050, then the powers that be, and all of them are the head of the corporations are Asperger's right shifters, may have decided and clubbed together that humanity needs to be controlled. And yet, I'll give you the simplest statistic to really, really clarify things for you. We said this before, but we haven't summarized it. If the average age of a coronavirus death is 82.4 years, and the average lifespan is a bit less than that, it means that average life, you have more chance of dying from the risks of average life than you do from corona. And if you then think that most of those deaths are in highly vulnerable people, then that gets even lower. And yet...
with underlying conditions.
Exactly. And yet, the government are now talking about vaccinating teenagers with a toxic chemical. With HIV and prion in it.
I'd like to go back to the point about governments being there for their people and about them being self-serving. If you needed another example, we've had many examples, we've just quoted them now already on this podcast. One from my personal experience, I actually sent a letter to Mr. Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary.
Did you know?
I did, and I received a response from his learned team. And of course he didn't answer my question. I've just mentioned it. There was a two sentence introduction. It was a weak attempt at being empathetic, and then they went into the rhetoric of we are doing this, that, and the other, which has got nothing to do with the question I asked. The main question I asked actually two questions. One could have been answered very quickly, and it wasn't at all. I said, will my exemption be reapplied? About with regards to travel.
Yes.
But I'm talking about the government if they're really there for their people. So it's a really simple thing, and it's again why I think you have to go down the fear tactics route as well, because people are completely apathetic. They don't like politicians, and they have had opportunities to endear themselves to the public, and they've failed miserably. So my other question was really simple. I said, I have the right, now I repeat, I have a legal right, even during the toughest restrictions, to visit my family in another country, in the EU, because that's where I live. That's where my 2 children and my wife reside. That's where my house and home is. That's legally, I can legally prove that, and that's a fact of life. I said, right, why is it that if your main aim is to take care of your people, your main aim is that you do not want the virus to spread, blah, blah, rhetoric, blah, 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 then why is it that I have to personally pay for certain tests? I'm not talking about what's required when I arrive over there. I'm talking about what's required when I come back here. Why is it that there is an infrastructure that's still in place with the lateral test, PCR testing, local councils, you can drive in, you can book in with an hour's notice. I've done it myself. Those are free. Why is it? And I know what you're going to say. And I hope you're going to say it in terms of the self-serving professors and scientists that are all on the pharmaceutical board. But why is it, and I've answered the question, but why is it that I have to pay up to £500 to do a little trip to Europe to see my family? I'm not able to see them now more than once a month because it's so extortionate, it's so costly. I said, please can you bring this down so I can see my wife and kids?
Because I'll tell you, it's not even the pharmaceutical, because as we said, vaccine passports are being withdrawn as far as we know. It's global reset. As we discussed last time, what was a luxury 50 years ago and is now taken for granted by Mr. and Mrs. Universal Credit, who think
the narrative is control. Is that what you're saying?
Control and oppression, because we cannot afford to use global resources as fast as we've been doing, is the theory. Except, of course, as we said before, that's not quite true. For instance, carbon emissions are historically average. Did you know that? They are not catastrophically high. What they're doing is they're comparing it to the 1960s, which is a historical low, maybe because we'd stopped using coal at home. But actually, carbon emissions are historically average, despite the fact that India and China are ramping up exponentially.
Yeah, okay. If you're going to talk about the environmental and the ecological narrative that now is being set by governments like Mr. Boris Johnson, who's brought it forward by 5 years, I'm a huge car enthusiast. I mean, I really have been into cars since I can remember. And I have tried to have semi-intelligent conversations with friends, with colleagues, people in, I'm selling, I'm working for the biggest car wash manufacturer in the world, and I go to the huge petrol forecourts, multi-million-pound.
And your steed is parked outside as we speak.
Yes, and nicely washed, thank you very much. And they are multi-million-pound businesses. Now, I'm having conversations with people who've been in the industry for 30 or 40 years, and I ask one question, and I say, okay, you haven't got an EV charging charger in place yet, and the answer is, well, I'm waiting because if I take that away, it's a business decision. Each car park space is worth £200 an hour to me, etc., etc. So that's a business decision. Fine, they're delaying it as much as possible. And I don't want to go into more detail because it'll get a little bit boring. However, the point is the same. The question I ask is, okay, can you please, learned one, experience in the motor forecourt industry, dealing with cars all day long, how is that electric car being fueled? Where is the electricity coming from? Yes, tell me about the carbon footprint of a hybrid electrical car.
Much worse.
And I said, right, tell me how many batteries there are underneath. What happens to those very toxic batteries in 10 years' time? How will they be recycled? Where is the current electricity coming from? Do we have enough on the national grid in the UK to support all these electric cars that are coming online? And if you can answer those questions properly, ethically, logically, I'll buy an electric car tomorrow. I'll go and
even Top Gear, even years ago,
but Jeremy Clarkson
and James May. James May said actually hydrogen is the future anyway,
which has been kiboshed and bought out by the petrol industry.
Has it really?
Of course it has. And this is going back just nearly 15 years when Honda came out with the first hydrogen prototype. I think near enough 15 years ago. Isn't it funny that idea was taken out of circulation? They tried on a couple of petrol stations in the US, disappeared out of sight. It's now come back again because the big companies like Shell are starting to realize, or have done it for the last 5 years, they have to diversify. There's been so much pressure, they have no choice. So hydrogen is now considered as an option, but it's still not been expanded or been invested
and
in.
it's much more practical. It's cleaner, it's quicker, it's easier.
It's potentially dangerous. I think the amount of pressure that goes into the car, you have to have a very reliable device that hooks onto the car to actually get that inside the car. Because if not, the repercussions can be explosive, let's say. But apart from that,
but there's been no. Obviously, it's a lot less, but there's been no evidence of that happening, has there?
To me, it's simple. It goes back to the same old arguments about vested interest. The same old arguments. The petrol companies still have roughly, from what I've read, 40 to 50 years worth of supplies of oil, therefore petrol, and they're not going to just write that off. It's not going to happen.
No, absolutely.
So while they are getting their act together, they need to turn that liquid into money.
That's exactly what they need to do, and and they can't. You can't force anything. All you can do is make people fearful enough to comply.
Yeah, but for example, I was listening to, I'm trying to think who I was listening to yesterday. Yes, I was listening to the other day to Chris Evans, quite a well-known DJ on Virgin Radio, quite a big radio station in the UK. And he, ex-presenter of Top Gear, car nut, runs car events across the country, real petrolhead. He turned around and said, I thought I'd try. I'm not really just going to preach about it. I'm going to go and find out what a Tesla's like. So he actually drove one. And he said, I will repeat, because obviously you have to be politically correct. You can't just have an opinion without prefacing it or warning, giving the government.
Because he's an influencer, really, isn't he?
So God forbid to have an opinion. So he turned around and said, I found the Tesla very boring. And I think a friend, somebody who texted in and said, it's like driving an iPad. It is a very boring car to be in and a boring car to look at. He said, I don't want anything to do with it. I think he bought a BMW, an old BMW i3, and he said it's a few years old. It's only got 120 miles range, but I need it for local. And I invested.
No, but that would be boring. But if you buy one of those 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, maybe slightly less boring.
But my point is that a petrolhead, somebody who's actually quite an intelligent guy, has turned around and said, I'm not going to buy this so-called market leader in electric cars, who is actually, I said to you before on previous podcast, Mr. Elon Musk is actually flooding the market with his cars that has never made any money in the last 12 years.
Because I think you told me.
He made a quarterly profit once because he wants to be the number one supplier of batteries.
Correct.
And to recycle and to sell new to all manufacturers. And he just got there first and has been developing the battery technology to a point where everybody will have to come to him. He will be the root source of all batteries, or with at least the latest technology. He's hired all the professors, all the scientists, leading ones that were bored, were doing nothing for many years. People were even working for NASA said, come over to me, I need your help. And now he's cornered the market. So everybody would be 2, 3, 4 years behind at a minimum. So very, very clever. But that again goes back to why should somebody, but if really electric cars were the future, again going back to the environmental illusion that we've been painted that we all need to buy electric cars and we're saving the planet. Forget how you get the electricity in the first place, which in effect is polluting the planet. But by the by, electric car, a hybrid car will do 34 miles to the gallon. A very clean petrol car will do 53. Try to understand. And then 10 years later, you have to get rid of the batteries. It doesn't make any sense. So why should a common person buy an electric car today? Do you know how much they've got to spend as a bare minimum for a basic electric car? Around £30,000.
I know.
Peugeot 208 is a great example. That same Peugeot 208, normal petrol, 1 litre, very, very fuel efficient, will cost you £14,000. So you've got to spend double the amount of money to have something that can't get you very far, so you have to recharge for a few hours.